We've just heard from an innovator and entrepreneur who is at the leading edge of personal transportation technologies that could become a trillion-dollar industry and bring us to the next major inflection point in road safety. We also learned that other countries are adopting policies to support the development and deployment of these advanced technologies in an effort to give themselves a lead in the global competition for automated and connected transportation. What does this policy environment look like? That's what our next panel is going to discuss.
Well, thank you, John. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm the transportation correspondent for Axios, and I co-author the Axios What's Next newsletter, which looks at the future of cities and work and transportation, and really just how technology is so rapidly changing our lives. You know, I've been covering the auto industry for 30 years almost now, and it's never been more interesting to cover. What we're seeing when it comes to autonomous vehicles is that they have evolved from sort of this novel science project to a potentially life-changing technology that can address some of America's most pressing transportation and mobility issues. We're talking about everything from driverless robo-taxis and self-driving trucks to urban delivery robots and maybe even privately owned consumer AVs. All of them are likely to play a big role in the pursuit of a cleaner, safer, and even more accessible transportation future in the US. And you know, it's not just the major global automakers that are pursuing this technology either. We've got some of the biggest giant tech companies and a lot of innovative startup companies as well that are pouring billions of dollars into the research, development, and testing in preparation for autonomous vehicles being safely deployed. But there are plenty of skeptics too, and both in the general public and the policy making community. So education is going to be very critical as we roll this technology out. That's why I'm so excited to be joined by today's expert panel. They come from three different AV companies, AV startups, in fact, but they share one very interesting thing in common. They all served as regulators of autonomous vehicles in the federal government. So they each have very different perspectives, and they've seen this from both sides. So I'd love to introduce them now as they join our discussion. James Owens is the head of regulatory affairs at Nuro, the robot delivery company. He's also a former acting administrator at NHTSA and a former deputy counsel for the U.S. Department of Transportation. Mark Rosekind is Chief Safety Innovation Officer at Zoox, which is working on a robo-taxi service and has developed its own vehicle. He was also a NHTSA administrator, and he served on the National Transportation Safety Board. And finally, we have Nat Buse, who is Vice President of Safety at Aurora. That's an AV technology company that is developing technology that could be used in a number of applications. They're going to be starting out with heavy trucks. He also oversaw vehicle safety as a associate administrator at NHTSA. So welcome to all of you. We're really looking forward to the discussion. Let's get started. You know, each of your companies is coming at this from at a different angle. You're all going into a different segment of autonomy. And I'd like to hear from each of you what the particular safety challenges are that your company is facing and what you're doing to address those issues. Let's start with James.
Thanks, Joann. And first of all, thank you to Auto Innovators for inviting us. This is a great panel. Great to be here with Mark and Nat. So Nuro, as you mentioned, we are developing and building a zero occupant vehicle delivery robot. So the idea here is this is effectively last mile or local delivery of everything from food from a restaurant or goods from a pharmacy up to including groceries and parcel posts going forward. So it's we're looking to replace a lot of the the vehicles on the roads that are much heavier vehicles driving on surface streets. And by having zero occupant vehicles, we think there's a safety advantage to that, and that's involved in by not only do we want to have on one hand the safety that everybody in this industry wants to achieve with autonomy, but also by taking humans out of the vehicle, we think that there's an opportunity here for reducing overall human exposure to risk on the roadways. And that's something that's going to exist for the foreseeable future. So by removing humans out of these vehicles, there's less exposure that occurs. So that's an additional margin of safety. And of course, since the vehicles are not designed to have humans inside, these are vehicles then that can be redesigned with the notion of maximizing safety for people on the outside of the vehicle. So for pedestrians and other vulnerable road users, as well as programming the autonomy to behave in ways that would be uncomfortable, I think, for occupants of a vehicle, but the vehicle can stop more sharply or take action in a way that might not be appropriate if there's a human being on board. So we think that that's an incredible advantage. We're really looking forward to as we continue to develop and deploy this technology. Of course, the challenges, I think, are something that everybody faces. Anytime you drive on a surface street in the United States, surface transportation is an incredibly complicated environment with a lot of moving parts. And so there's a lot of work to do on the autonomy side to make sure that we're seeing the kind of safe driving that we all want to see going forward. I think in addition, anybody who's developing a new innovative design vehicle needs to make sure that, of course, we're staying on the right side of the regulators and existing safety standards. So we are building hardware, of course, that will meet the safety standards. That's the goal. But going forward, of course, one of the things I think everybody in this industry would like to see is that if NHTSA can start removing some of the unnecessary barriers for the old standards that reflect manually driven cars and start updating and modernizing those standards to reflect vehicles that might have novel or new configurations and may require different kinds of safety standards.
Right. There's a lot of work to be done to enable that. But, Mark, your company, Zoox, is moving people, but with no driver. Tell us, what your concerns are, how your vehicle will communicate with people, pedestrians and cyclists outside, and, what your safety challenges are.
And thanks, Joann, because I think you set this up by identifying there are actually multiple models, right, using new technology. And people go right to AVs, and the reality is there are all kinds of other support kinds of technologies that are pretty important right now as well. And so for Zoox, we are focused on a robo-taxi model that is fully autonomous. So we're going right to that level 4, level 5. It's all electric and bidirectional, no front or back, basically. So I mentioned that because basically it's been designed to operate in a congested city. Okay, so to your point, the safety challenges that Zoox will face have to do with the dynamic, complex environment of operating within a city. So you've got people in the vehicle, you've got people around the vehicle, double parked vehicles and narrow roads, all kinds of safety challenges that you're not going to see on an open road or just with packages. So again, you have a different model. We picked specifically operating in cities to help with congestion, sustainability, all the things we know that can be improved there. And I would just say, the biggest safety challenge is the complexity and how dynamic that environment is. Because as you're pointing out, you have to protect the people in the vehicle, but all the other road users as well. And at Zoox, that includes using sound and light to communicate with people so they know what's going on with the vehicle. What happens when you lose that cross the crosswalk and you're trying to get your eyes locked with the person behind the wheel and that goes away? Well, you can use light, sound, and other means to try and communicate with all those other road users around you.
Right. Okay. And Nat, talk to us a little bit about the challenges of autonomous trucking. In many people say, hey, that's the easiest thing. You just got to drive in a straight line. But I'm sure that is not as easy as it sounds. And yet I do, we have heard that trucking will in fact be the first application of this in a large commercial deployment. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure, Joanne, and thanks again to Auto Innovators for having this group together. It's been a while since I think all three of us have actually talked to each other in the same format. So this is really great, and I think give an opportunity to share just kind of how all these things fit together. Because I think, like Mark was saying, sometimes there's a tendency to go to one thing, and this thing is actually a little bit more complicated than that. And so for trucking, there are a couple of things I would say that are challenges in addition to what has already been mentioned. So one is you have to be able to deal with the commercial load that you're carrying. So we're doing pilots right now, for example, with FedEx to sort of gain that experience because it matters on how you program autonomy to deal with those sort of dynamics on the roadway. And yeah, for sure, I wish it was just driving in a straight line, but for sure it's not. We've got to be able to lane change. We've got to be able to nudge around different vehicles. And we even have to deal with pedestrians. A lot of people will say that, well, it's on the highway, you don't have to worry about pedestrians. In fact, we have seen not one, but several pedestrians, and not next to broken down vehicles, just casually taking a stroll on the highway in Texas. So this is sort of an interesting phenomena that we need to account for and deal with. And really, this comes down to understanding the operational design domain that you're going into and understanding all of the capabilities that you need to do that. And so we've all talked about sort of the engineering side of developing the driver. But to me, there's also another challenge that actually transcends all three of these companies. And it's really around how you talk about the safety that you're putting into the product overall. So, we put out, of course, the safety case framework, which is our way of showing kind of our work on how we're doing that. But that's really important because the challenge that we're all going to face is public trust, as you mentioned. And that's kind of a big thing, as well as making the vehicle safe. It's also like, how do you convince and share in a very transparent way with the public why they should think you're able to be out there anyway. And that actually starts now. I mean, we're doing that today with even our current vehicle operators and sort of explaining how they're trained and what are all the things that we go through to make sure that when a piece of code lands on the vehicle, that it's actually safe to be on there, regardless of whether we have a VO or not.
Right. Okay. Now, well, as former regulators, you all have a very close eye on what's happening in Washington, I'm sure. And the question I have, it seems like the technology is getting very close to deployment, but will the policy and regulatory framework be ready? I mean, James talked already a little bit about the challenges of vehicles that don't have human occupants, and how those are special cases right now, but they will need to be new regulations around that. Let's start with Mark. How do you feel, where we are in terms of the regulatory environment?
Yeah, Joanne, it's so important to start here with regulation and then immediately move to realize that NHTSA and DOT actually have a whole suite of tools to promote safety. I mean, that's what the regulations are about, is promoting safety. And at the agency, at NHTSA in particular, you can have safety programs that are educational, right, and that do enforcement and other kinds of things. You have the new car assessment program, you've got regulation, you've just got policy statements that can do things. There's a large suite of tools that allow you to promote safety in all these areas. So specifically around regulation, I always warn people, they take a long time. So as administrator, the things I actually signed into law were in the pipeline 8 to 10 years. Matt will tell you rear view, 10, 12 years, rear view cameras. It's like these things take a long time. So when people say, well, the regulations are going to be behind, it's like, yeah, they're pretty much always going to be behind because if you think about it, the government doesn't actually create these things and deploy them, right? They're being responsive to whatever the industry is actually creating. And so I think what's really important about your question is regulation is a very powerful and critical tool, but the agency really needs to be thinking about the full range of tools that are available that it can use to promote safety. And one of the challenges, which you've already highlighted, is it's not like they have one model that they have to regulate. You've got delivery and trucks and robo-taxi, right? And then all the ADAS, right? The advanced driver assistance systems and welder. That's not one thing. That's like a whole bag of stuff that's going to be out on the roadways. So in that case, the agency really needs to use its full set of tools to try and promote safety.
I think some people would be surprised to learn that the states are also going to play a big role in regulating how this technology comes out. James, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, well, first of all, echo what Mark said. The regulators have, whether you're state or federal, they have a lot of tools in their tool chest. And the question that should be asked is not, are the regulations ready? I think it's what do we want to achieve, and then from there, how do we get there? And I think if we want to see the benefits of ADS and the safety potential of it, and we want to see this develop and then deploy on a widespread basis, I think then all the regulators, state and local, or state and federal, need to think about what are the tools available to them to both incentivize it to occur, remove the barriers that stand in the way of it occurring, but also ensure that as the development and deployment is occurring, it's being done in a safe and responsible way. One of the areas here, as you mentioned, is the state. So the traditional breakdown of regulation of vehicle safety in the United States is that the feds, NHTSA, regulate vehicle technology, and the states regulate vehicle operations. I think where ADS is going to be an interesting challenge going forward for everybody is that ADS is a hybrid of the two. You can't divorce the operational safety from the technology itself. And so there's going to be a lot of questions, I think, about how the feds and the states should work together moving forward. Last year, NHTSA launched the AV Test Initiative, and the purpose of that was to bring the states and the federal government and developers together to talk more about these issues, start working through these issues now, and not kick the can until the day when ADS, NHTSA is ready to start regulating ADS. I think we need to have those conversations now, because at some point, the states are going to have to be comfortable with NHTSA taking action that could implicate some operational issues. And NHTSA needs to be well educated, I think, by the states about what are the operational issues and how best to approach that. So this is going to be an interesting challenge, I think, over the next decade plus as this technology begins to deploy. And we're going to see challenges from at the state level and at the federal level.
Now, how do you see that conflict, that tension between states and the federal government playing out? What are ways that we can avoid a patchwork of regulatory environments? Because I'm sure Mark does not want to deploy his taxis only in San Francisco. We want delivery robots everywhere. We want trucks everywhere. This is a unique situation. How does it get solved?
Right. Yeah. Really. Thanks for the question. I'll go at it in a couple of different ways. So, because we're also working on ride sharing as well. I mean, we have a great partnership with Uber and a great partnership with Toyota. So many of these same issues apply to us, but we get to deal with it all. And I mean that in the most sincere way, right? Because we're doing commercial trucking, which also implicates the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, which also has a different regulatory oversight and arrangement with the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, the police enforcement that's used for that kind of segment of the roadway, and all these folks need to have a seat at the table. I think one of the things in each of the Mark's tenure and James's tenure, one of the things that the federal government did very well was to kind of bring people together, specifically talking about the convening power that US DOT has in order to get all the stakeholders and the right stakeholders at the table to talk about the issues that need to be addressed. I think one of the things that maybe help clarifying for the audience is when you talk about the self-driving technology itself. So for us, that's the Aurora Driver. We're good from a federal level, right? And in most states, we're good. It actually has driven where we are deploying because of restrictions in some states that don't even allow self-driving. That's one thing that definitely needs to be solved and be worked on. But from an initial deployment status, actually what we have right now from just the core technology is actually workable. The issues come in when you have these different kind of product offerings, we'll call them, when you want to change the vehicle design, when you want to do other things, let's say with respect to going across state lines. And all of these things now start to complicate kind of commercial application depending on what you're doing with an individual product. Again, for us on trucking, we sort of mapped that out and kind of know exactly what we're doing and what that leeway looks like in the different states that we plan to go into. But if we wanted to wake up today and pull the driver, let's say in Texas, we can do that, right? When we think we're safe and ready. But we can't do that in California right now because of the restrictions on commercial trucking. And so, I think the federal government has a big role to play in convening folks and getting them together. I think reinforcing the issue that James brought up with respect to I don't really like using the terms traditional, state, and federal because I don't think there's anything traditional about what we're getting ready to do. But I think reinforcing, particularly at the state level, that NHTSA has a lot of tools, and states don't need to replicate those tools for vehicle safety, and that there's other issues that are well within their purview that they need to kind of continue to work on: operations, licensing, insurance. Those are things that the states are very well adept at. And the last thing I'll say is we tend to also only talk about this at the state level, but there's also been an interesting thing happening with localities that also needs to be kind of addressed and kind of in our minds, which is, you can imagine a scenario if every locality then stood up and said, well, hey, if it's up to me to be responsible for the safety of this thing, I'm going to say no, or I'm going to say yes, or whatever. And then within a state, you could have different rules, and that would just be something that would, I think, particularly crush the benefits of this technology that are beyond our wildest dreams.
I think Nat has just described why all of you have jobs at these companies, because this is the stuff you have to sort out. I've noticed that NHTSA seems to be taking perhaps a more aggressive stance when it comes to oversight of assisted driving technology, ADAS systems like Tesla Autopilot. These are not full autonomy, but I'm curious if you would agree and how that might affect how and when you can roll out full autonomy. How does the ADAS situation affect the rollout of full autonomy, if at all?
Yeah, I can start with that. I think it's made it more complicated. I think in some fantasy world, a bunch of engineers came up with all these levels, and I guess I was part of that fantasy world initially because NHTSA had its own levels at one point. But it was a tool for engineers. It was never meant to be a tool to communicate to the public. And somehow we took an engineering tool and said, well, it's good enough for engineers, we'll use it for the public, which has never been the case. And so we have this mass confusion now going on with technology that's on roads today that actually saves lives, something like automatic emergency braking, being mixed into the same conversation with something like adaptive cruise control, which arguably is more of a driver convenience feature, has nothing really to do with safety, being mixed into the conversation with, level 4 technologies that we're working on that are really meant to only rely on the computer to do the driving and not, a human, and certainly in very limited ODs and not like all over the place all the time, at least not right away, right? And it's all happening at the same time. And so I think we need to do a much better job just continuing to reinforce that there are differences here, and these differences will be with us for a very long time. It takes any one piece of technology, it can take 2.5 decades to penetrate the fleet. And that's even after Mark was talking about if you actually regulate it, the whole part before that. So this stuff just takes time to get into the fleet. And I'm always reminded of airbags where, that if you go back and look at the history, that was almost a 2.5 decades kind of rulemaking onslaught. When you look at all the different pieces that got added over time, no one tried to solve the whole problem all at once. There was a lot of work done very methodically over a long period of time. And you can argue that's a very simple technology, right? You measure some G-forces, you deploy a bag with some pyrotechnics. And what we're doing is obviously a lot different than that. And so we need to continue the education mantra with the public and be very, very clear about what we're talking about, which is, in this panel here, for sure, we're all talking the same language, which is self-driving vehicles, not anything to do with drivers taking over and that kind of stuff.
Very interesting. Thanks, Nat. Mark, what would you add here?
Just quickly, I think I would just say, this gets to the evolution versus revolution, right? There's some people that think we have to evolve through these technologies to get to full automation. Others, let's go directly to it. That's a hypothesis, right? I think the most important thing that Matt was just highlighting is we've got 20 or 30 years where our roadways will include people with hands on the wheels, people that have ADAS, different kinds of technologies, and full autonomy. And everyone who's trying to guess what it's going to look like 30 years from now, good luck with that, right? Because you've got all these different models, all these different ways. Let's do it step by step versus no, we're going right to it. Yeah, it's hard, but we'll go right to it. So I think, everyone who's trying to crystal ball what's happening, um, we don't know. We don't know. And that's why it's so critical to make sure that we're going to have data and that there's going to be transparency, the trust issue you brought up, because this is going to be with us for at least 20 to 30 years as we're figuring this stuff out.
That's a great point. James, anything to add on that?
Well, absolutely. So I think, and of course, Nat hit on it. The ADAS versus ADS, very different technologies. ADAS technologies are about assisting a human driver in the driving task, and ADS is a completely different animal. And the public and drivers need to understand the difference. That, I think, goes without saying. I do think, though, that the process at this, the way in which this is occurring, shows the advantages of the U.S. system of regulation. The way Congress set up the structure within which NHTSA regulates motor vehicle safety, NHTSA sets very specific standards about very specific things, such as ESC, for instance, or rear view cameras. But in between that, in between those points, as it were, NHTSA has this very broad, powerful defect authority and investigative authority, and that provides room for innovation to occur, but also provides that oversight of safety regulation to ensure that the safety regulator can look into whatever's being developed and take action if there is a safety need. So I think on one hand, nobody wants to be enforced against, but on the other hand, it is part of the structure and why so much of the development, I think, is occurring here in the U.S., because there really is this latitude that for development and, as I said, a safety oversight for this development as it continues to occur.
All right. Well, the other topic I wanted to talk about, Congress has not yet passed any kind of AV legislation, but they are sounding the alarm, in particular about the competition with China and the risk that the United States falls behind China on this technology where, let's face it, most of the development is happening. Even Chinese companies come to the US to develop. So I wonder how you see that risk. Nat, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think it's very real. I mean, I obviously got to serve with both Mark and James at the department. And I think we always, at least the three of us, I think, would talk about this issue kind of very directly. We've had a good run here in the U.S. We've had the technology here for well over a decade. Kind of even going back, maybe even before that, when you talk about if you want to bring in the DARPA project into that. And I think that when I watch what other countries are doing around this space, they're not waiting around. So you see lots of investment, of course, in China, as you mentioned, but they're not the only ones. It's not like the Europeans are sitting around going, well, we'll just wait for a little while. And I think it comes down to not just a kind of a economic competitiveness for the country, but I think it comes to a competitive for all of us as like human beings on the planet, right? We have a crisis when it comes to fatalities on our roadways. This year we will likely approach numbers that we have not seen in a decade when it comes to motor vehicle crashes. When we arguably have the safest vehicles we've ever had, the best roads we've ever had, there's something going on there. And we need to understand that this technology that we're working on, no matter the product that we're sort of putting it on, whether that be robo delivery or taxi or whatever we want to call it, that will have tremendous benefit to reshape how we think about transportation and transportation equity. And so to me, it's not just about the economic competitiveness and who's going to win on the technology and all that kind of stuff. It's this other piece too, that we're losing a significant number of the population. And if you want to throw GDP numbers in there, like it's a non-trivial amount of the nation's GDP that we're losing every year to motor vehicle crashes. And so we've got to go focus there. And it just becomes a natural thing that we have it all here. Why aren't we doing what we need to do to make it succeed?
James, you're nodding. What would you like to say on that topic?
So, with respect to international, what's going on internationally, number one, competition is good. Competition keeps everybody on top of their game, and we want to see more competition. Everybody wants to win, but we want, competition incentivizes good behavior. Yeah, I think, on one hand, you want to be concerned about regulators anywhere acting prematurely in this space because the technology is under development, and regulators best regulate when the technology is known and understood, and not acting prematurely. So that's something that regulators acting too prematurely overseas, for instance, could stymie innovation there. But certainly what Nat said, we have a national and indeed a global issue with traffic safety. And one of the things that we had a chance to look back on last year when we did a retrospective for NHTSA's 50 years was that traffic fatality rates have dropped 75% since NHTSA was created in 1970. And that's a tremendous number. That's wonderful. And every decade of NHTSA's existence, you saw tremendous progress in the drops in the fatality rate. And that is wonderful. And until about 10 years ago or so, and over the past 10 years or so, this is what Nat's referring to, we've kind of plateaued on safety. And yet vehicles are safer than ever. And then you look at what happened last year. And I was, of course, at NHTSA during the pandemic, and the fatality numbers, the crash numbers that were coming in were horrific, and turned upside down in such a hurry so quickly. NHTSA did research that showed from crash victims from trauma centers that showed that 2/3 of drivers in those studies who were in fatal or near fatal crashes had detectable levels of drugs or alcohol in their blood. So what we're seeing is not that vehicles became less safe last year. In fact, they're safer than they've ever been. What we're seeing is that I think we've hit a plateau where it's human behavior is we're bumping up against. And that's where this technology that we're all working on comes into play, right? It's to overcome those human mistakes, that reckless human behavior that unfortunately we're seeing today and continuing to see. And so, this is, I think, the best hope we have of making that next big safety breakthrough. So I think that's why we're all here, and I think that's why all of our companies are so focused on the opportunities that this entails.
Joann,
Mark. Yeah, go ahead, please, Mark.
I'm going to do a wrap for some of this. Sadly, we're at the end of this time, and it's the first opportunity to give the number. 38,680 lives lost in 2020 on US roadways, 100 every day. Einstein taught us, keep doing the same thing, expect a different outcome. That's the definition of insanity. And so if we really want to make a difference here, technology is the new tool. And there are NHTSA studies that show that. And so that's what I'm saying. You've got 3 safety professionals here who, our motivation is to know how this technology is going to make a difference in that number. And so, we'd be naive not to think there's global competition, but I just think, at the end of the day here, at the end of this panel, for most of us, it's all about the safety and the other advantages of mobility and the climate, et cetera. But man, it is all about the lives that we can save, the injuries and crashes we can prevent. And I just got to say, I think technology is the new tool, and we got to figure out how far it can get us to saving those lives.
That is a perfect way to end our panel. I really so want to thank all of you for your insights today. It's really been a fascinating conversation. Thanks very much.